Detective Miles Corbin had a face built for shadow and smoke. 35 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of a decade spent in the grimiest corners of the city's major crimes unit. He was a creature of the night shift, and tonight, the Midvalley Precinct was an empty tomb echoing his solitude. Midvalley wasn't a sprawling metropolis, but its darkness was deep, woven into the city's ancient, crumbling infrastructure. The precinct itself was a testament to that decay, a brutalist monolith from the 70s, too big for its current staff, with endless corridors and disused wings. They called it the concrete whale. Miles was hunched over a cold coffee and a stack of cold case files, the kind of files that went cold not because the leads dried up, but because the victim simply ceased to be. The latest was the disappearance of a young woman named Elara Vane, last seen near the old railway yard. No body, no ransom, just a meticulously neat apartment and a missing person report filed by a frantic sister. A sudden, sharp clang ripped through the oppressive silence of the 2 a.m. hour. Miles straightened, his chair scraping on the linoleum. It sounded metallic, like a heavy door slamming, but it came from the direction of the lower sub-level storage, a place theoretically locked down, used only for old evidence and forgotten locker banks. He was the only person officially in the building aside from Desk Sergeant Ramirez, whose snoring was currently vibrating the glass window of his cubicle. Miles grabbed his sidearm, the familiar weight a thin comfort, and moved out of the cramped office. The light in the hallway flickered, casting strobe-like shadows that made the corridor stretch into a disorienting, black and white tunnel. He took the rusted utility stairs down to the sublevel. The air down here was different, stale, heavy, and rank with the smell of old paper and mildew. He passed the evidence cage, a chain-link tomb guarded by a single, weak bulb. The clang hadn't come from here. It had come from the old locker banks, a maze of obsolete metal compartments once used by officers from a generation ago. They stretched deep into the basement's dark recesses, a labyrinth of dented, olive-green steel. Miles rounded a corner. He stopped dead. One of the lockers, number 314, was slightly ajar. The heavy steel door wasn't just pulled open, it was hanging crookedly, its top hinge visibly strained. Someone, or something, had forced it. Miles approached, his boots silent on the dusty concrete. He pushed the locker door fully open with the muzzle of his gun. Inside was nothing but dust and a single, ancient, moth-eaten woolen police cap, but as he scanned the empty metal box, a sound emerged from within, a faint, wet tapping. It was slow, rhythmic, and seemed to resonate from the hollow back wall of the locker. Tap. 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 It was a sound that shouldn't be possible. The lockers were simply thin metal boxes against a solid cinder block wall. Miles cautiously reached his hand inside, running his gloved fingers along the back. The metal felt cold, but not smooth. In the center, there was a patch that felt flexible. It was thin, like the metal had been deliberately thinned or somehow dissolved from the inside out. He pressed harder. The flexible area gave, making a sickening, crunching sound like a beetle's shell breaking, and then, the tapping stopped. Instead, a whisper, so close it felt like breath on his ear, though the locker was a foot away, slithered out of the darkness of the broken metal. "You found my door, Miles." Miles flinched back, drawing his gun fully. The voice was neither male nor female, but something flat and dry, like old parchment tearing. He knew that voice. It was impossible, insane, but the timbre was unmistakable. It was the voice of Elara Vane, the missing woman he was supposed to be finding. Hook, a mysterious, thin spot in an old locker, leads a detective to the impossible voice of his current missing person victim, who warns him he's found her door. Miles's breath hitched, vaporizing in the cold basement air. His grip on the SIG Sauer tightened until his knuckles were white, the muzzle pointed squarely at the empty locker's interior. He waited for a second sound, a movement, anything to validate the impossible words he'd just heard. Silence. Heavy, complete silence, thicker than the dust on the floor. "Show yourself," Miles grated, his voice a low, rough challenge that felt ludicrous, directed at an inanimate piece of metal. He took a slow step back, then forced himself to step forward again. Rationalize it, he thought, the years of police work demanding logic. A fluke. Air pressure, maybe a vent, a trick of the echo. But the locker bank was dead air, and the voice had been intimate, a direct address, Miles. He lowered the gun slightly, shining his tactical light directly onto the back of locker 314. The light beam hit the section that felt thin, the flexible spot. It wasn't just thin metal, it was almost translucent in the high-intensity light. And on its surface, clinging to the edges of the weakness, was a faint, sticky residue. It was a dull, dark brown, slightly iridescent, like dried, metallic sap.as. Miles leaned in closer, a faint, rhythmic scratching sound began, like fingernails dragging across chalk, coming directly from behind the thin section. Miles pulled his hand away as if burned. That was no echo. Suddenly, his police radio crackled to life, the noise exploding in the silence of the basement, causing him to jump. Corbin? That you down there? What the hell was that racket? Sounded like a damn dumpster collision. It was Desk Sergeant Ramirez, awake and sounding deeply displeased. Miles pressed the transmit button, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. Negative, Sarge. Just me. Dropped a stack of old evidence boxes. Paperwork mess. Go back to sleep. You better clean it up. Don't want any rats getting to the financials, Ramirez grumbled before the radio hissed back into static silence. The interruption, jarring as it was, gave Miles a moment to regain his footing. He holstered his sidearm, pulling out his investigative gloves and a small evidence bag. If that sticky material was a clue, or God help him, something biological, he needed to bag it. He crouched down, examining the dusty floor directly in front of locker 314. His flashlight beam swept across the concrete, and there, resting almost innocently amidst the grime, was something that hadn't been there a minute ago. It was a small, smooth object, intricately carved from dark wood. Miles carefully picked it up. It felt warm to the touch, almost feverish. It was a wooden token, perfectly circular, slightly smaller than a 50-cent piece. On its surface, carved with impossibly fine detail, was a symbol, a concentric spiral that started from a single, impossibly precise dot in the center and wound outwards. It looked like a stylized, mesmerizing eye. He recognized the pattern, a fleeting memory from the Elara Vane file. A similar symbol had been drawn on a napkin found near the last known sighting. It had been dismissed as random doodling. Miles stared at the token, its sudden appearance defying all logic. He was the only one down here. As his thumb traced the cold, winding grooves of the spiral, a high-pitched electrical hum began to resonate from the ceiling, rapidly escalating in pitch. Miles instinctively looked up. The single, weak light bulb flickering in the evidence cage across the way suddenly popped with a sharp, glass-shattering crack. Then, one by one, the remaining utility lights in the entire sub-level, the emergency lights, the exit signs, the cage bulbs, all extinguished with sickening, muffled thuds. The concrete whale swallowed the light whole. Miles was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness, the kind of darkness that felt less like an absence of light and more like a crushing, physical presence. The only light left was the weak, struggling beam of his tactical flashlight, illuminating only the wooden token in his hand and the ominous, shimmering stain on the back of locker 314. And then, he heard the echo again. Not the whisper this time. It was a faint, slithering sound, and it was coming from the mouth of the darkened corridor behind him. It was moving closer. Hook. Miles finds a warm, spiral-carved wooden token linked to the missing person, which immediately triggers a power outage, plunging him into absolute darkness with an unknown presence approaching. The darkness was total, a velvet shroud woven with the smell of wet concrete and decay. Miles didn't move, holding his breath, relying on the primal instincts honed by years of walking the city's darkest alleyways. The slithering sound was close now, an unnatural friction against the floor, punctuated by an almost inaudible scrape-hitch scrape. It didn't sound like anything he had ever tracked. That he shifted his weight, rotating slowly, careful not to make a sound that would give away his position. His flashlight beam was locked onto the wooden token and the locker. He fought the urge to shine it into the blackness behind him. He knew that the moment he pointed his light, he would become a beacon for whatever was approaching. The scraping stopped, silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. Miles knew the entity was within striking distance, perhaps just a few feet away, lurking in the absolute zero of the lightless corridor. Then, the air itself began to change. Miles felt a low, vibrating humming against his eardrums, coupled with a sensation like static electricity running across his skin. His arm hair stood on end, and a faint, acrid smell, like burnt metal and ozone, began to permeate the air. His flashlight, which had been steady, began to flicker violently, its beams cycling between blinding brightness and near-total darkness, mirroring the erratic static building around him. Through the erratic flash of the light, in the fraction of a second when the beam was at its brightest, Miles saw it was impossibly tall, an elongated shadow that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It stood at the mouth of the locker aisle, maybe 20 feet away. It wasn't human. Its outline was blurred, shimmering, like looking at an image through heat haze or rippling water. The only discernible feature was a mass of fine, wire-like tendrils that seemed to be actively drinking the air around it. It moved with a sudden, impossible jerk, covering half the distance in a single, soundless lurch. Miles didn't hesitate. He brought up his sidearm and squeezed the trigger twice, the sound of the shots deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash momentarily illuminated the scene, showing the concrete walls and the rows of lockers. The second the flash dissipated, the creature was gone. No sound of a body hitting the floor. No scream, no blood. The bullets had hit the wall of lockers behind where the entity had been standing, leaving two neat, smoking entry points. Miles backed up against locker 314, breathing hard. He hadn't missed. The thing had vanished instantly, the vibrating static intensified, and his ears began to ring painfully. Miles looked down at the wooden spiral token still clutched in his hand. The wood was no longer just warm, it was hot, almost painfully so, and the spiral pattern seemed to be shimmering, radiating a faint, dull crimson light that cut through the darkness. That he instinctively hurled the token away from him, towards the end of the aisle. The moment the token left his hand and clattered onto the concrete, the excruciating static vanished. The ringing in his ears stopped, and the flashlight beam steadied, bathing the aisle in a normal, albeit weak, yellow glow. Miles stood alone, the scent of gunpowder thick in the air. He shone the light toward the token. It lay innocently on the floor, no longer glowing or hot. That he took a hesitant step toward the bullet holes in the locker wall. "Elara," he muttered, trying the missing woman's name. "What in God's name is happening?" He got no reply from the locker, but as he was about to turn and retreat up the stairs, his light caught something on the floor, near the base of the bullet-riddled lockers. It was a small, black object. Miles cautiously picked it up. It was a single human tooth. It was unnaturally large, the enamel shiny, and it was still slightly warm. It didn't look like any molar or incisor he'd ever seen. It was conical, almost like a miniature shark tooth. Attached to the root of the tooth was a tiny, dried scrap of fibrous material. Miles brought the light closer, his blood turning to ice as he recognized the fine, distinctive pattern of the material. It was a shred of Elara Vane's expensive black blazer, the jacket listed in her missing person report. The metallic scraping sound began again, closer this time, and it was no longer coming from the corridor. It was coming from directly above him, filtering through the low ceiling tiles of the sublevel. It was walking on the floor above. And the floor above was Miles Corbin's office. Hook, Miles is attacked by a light-absorbing entity, which disappears only when he throws the spiral token. He finds a large, conical, human tooth attached to a shred of the missing victim's clothing, realizing the entity is now directly above his workspace. Miles moved immediately, the adrenaline washing away the shock. The sound from above was unmistakable now, a slow, heavy drag followed by a soft, almost silken slide. It was the sound of a very large, dense body being pulled across the old linoleum floor of the administrative wing. His administrative wing that he didn't waste time going back for the spiral token. He sprinted toward the utility stairs, the single tooth clenched tightly in his gloved hand. He didn't bother with stealth. Every beat of his running footsteps was a desperate plea for speed, the ascent felt agonizingly slow. As he burst through the fire door onto the ground floor, the scraping sound above ceased abruptly. The silence was instantaneous, profound, and utterly terrifying. The ground floor, which housed the main administrative offices, the break room, and Miles's small major crimes office, was vast and normally well lit. Now, it was eerily dark, lit only by the weak, greenish glow of the emergency exit signs and the faint light filtering from Sergeant Ramirez's cubicle near the entrance. Miles crept down the central hallway, his back pressed against the wall. The door to his office, MC3, was 20 yards away. That he realized what the new silence meant. The entity wasn't just moving across the floor, it was now listening. That he slowed his breathing, trying to match the near-silent hum of the building's ancient HVAC system. He could still hear the distant, steady snoring of Ramirez near the front desk, a human anchor in a sea of unnatural dread. As he neared the door to his office, a strange, sickening aroma hit him, not the burnt ozone from the basement, but something sweeter, heavier. It smelled like gardenias and drying blood, a perfume of decay and high floral notes. That he reached the door of MC3. It was closed, but the aluminum plaque bearing his name, Det. M. Corbin, was resting crookedly on the floor beneath the frame. Someone or something had deliberately tilted it and let it drop. Miles hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold steel of the doorknob. He pressed his ear to the wood panel. Nothing. No scrape, no drag, not even the sound of breathing. That he took a deep breath, kicked the door hard, and plunged inside, gun raised. The office was empty. Miles swept the flashlight beam across the cramped space, his desk, the overflowing inbox, the corkboard covered with case photos, the filing cabinet. All normal, but then, he noticed the subtle, insidious changes. The chair, a heavy, executive-style piece of furniture, had been meticulously centered in the middle of the room, facing the door, and across his desk, draped like a macabre decoration over the computer monitor, was a single, long strand of human hair. It was unnaturally smooth, black as pitch, and impossibly long, perhaps 3 feet in length. Miles approached the desk cautiously. He reached out with the tooth still in his hand and nudged the hair. It wasn't hair at all. It was a single, fine wire, thin as silk but clearly metallic, reflecting the flashlight's beam with a dull sheen. And then he saw the final piece, a single, glistening trail running from his chair, across the desk, and ending precisely where the hair was draped. It was the same sticky, dark brown, iridescent residue he'd found on the back of locker 314. That the entity hadn't been standing in his office, it had been sitting in his chair, waiting. Miles heard a soft, rhythmic snick sound coming from the ceiling tiles directly above his desk. It was the sound of something sharp and hard gently clicking against the gypsum board, as if testing the material's strength. He looked up, aiming his light at the ceiling. The tiles were all uniformly dirty, except for one, directly over the chair. It was a pristine white square, brand new, with a tiny, dark stain in the center. Before Miles could react, a piece of the clean tile, no bigger than a quarter, popped out and dropped onto his desk with a light tap. Through the small, jagged hole, a drop of the thick, dark brown liquid fell, hitting the surface of his desk. Miles instinctively jumped back toward the door. As he moved, the muffled sound of Sergeant Ramirez's snoring from the front desk stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Miles knew whatever had been sitting in his chair had either moved to the front of the precinct or, worse, had somehow just reached Ramirez. He had to get to the sergeant. Hook. The entity is not just moving, but actively stalking Miles, leaving evidence like a metallic hair and an identical, sticky residue in his chair. The discovery is immediately followed by the abrupt cessation of the desk sergeant's snoring, indicating a direct, imminent threat to the only other person in the building. Miles burst out of his office, his focus laser-sharp. The front desk was a good 100-foot dash down the main administrative corridor. His tactical light cut through the gloom, illuminating the path with a shaky urgency. The sweet, sickly scent of gardenias and blood was much stronger now, coating the air in a thick, metallic humidity. He reached the last corner leading to the reception area, the place where Desk Sergeant Ramirez had been sleeping seconds ago. Miles dropped into a low crouch, sweeping his light beam into the space. The sight was immediately wrong, sickeningly so. Sergeant Ramirez was still there, sitting upright in his high-backed, cracked leather chair, facing the empty lobby. He was perfectly motionless. His glasses were slightly askew, and his mouth was open in what Miles initially thought was mid-snore, but the silence was absolute. Ramirez wasn't breathing. Miles approached with agonizing caution. The sergeant's cubicle, normally cluttered with forms and thermos cups, was meticulously clean. The mess of papers that had been on his desk was gone. The entire surface was wiped down, glistening slightly in the artificial light. Miles reached the edge of the desk and looked closer at the sergeant. Ramirez's skin was the color of old porcelain, and his eyes, wide open and staring, were milky white, completely devoid of iris or pupil. They looked like two enormous, polished marbles, but the most disturbing detail was the sergeant's uniform. His shirt and jacket were not torn or bloody, they were subtly, meticulously shrunken. They clung to his body, the sleeves riding up his forearms, the collar biting into his neck. It was as if the fabric had been subjected to impossible shrinkage. On the desk, right next to Ramirez's hand, was a single, crystal-clear glass tumbler. It was not the cheap plastic cup the sergeant usually used. It was elegant, thin-walled, and completely full of a thick, opaque liquid. The same dark brown, iridescent sap. Miles knew that liquid was the key. He looked at Ramirez's outstretched hand. The sergeant's index finger was resting lightly on the glass, leaving a faint, smeary trail on the side. Miles reached out to check the sergeant's pulse, but froze. Reflected in the slick, dark surface of the liquid in the tumbler was a fleeting movement. Miles's own reflection was there, strained and illuminated, but in the background, over his shoulder, the reflection showed the empty lobby, except for one detail. In the far corner of the lobby, where the glass display case for precinct commendations stood, the reflection showed a shadow that was too long, too blurred, and actively moving toward the glass. Miles spun around, gun raised, aiming at the lobby. The lobby was dark and silent. The glass display case, where retired Captain Harrison's framed commendation medal was always displayed, was exactly where it should be, but as Miles watched, a new sound emerged, the delicate, rhythmic sound of glass being scored. It was a high-pitched, almost musical zzzt, coming from within the display case. Miles approached the case slowly, his light fixed on the thick, tempered glass. There was no sign of a break-in, no shattered window. He looked closer at the interior of the case, focusing on the framed metal. The glass surface protecting the commendation was vibrating faintly. Miles leaned his head to the side, trying to identify the sound. The scoring stopped at a muffled, gurgling sound came from inside the frame, followed by a wet, squelching noise. Miles shone his light directly at the frame. The brass plate below the metal had been carefully unscrewed and was lying flat on the felt, and behind the glass of the frame, where Captain Harrison's name should have been, the entity had left a message, written in the same dark, iridescent liquid. The words weren't simply drawn, they seemed to be seeping through the canvas backing of the award. Miles squinted, the words an impossible, agonizing calligraphy of dread. He has your time, and you have mine. 314, as Miles read the final number, the dead. Sergeant Ramirez, sitting silent in his chair, suddenly jerked. His head snapped forward, and his mouth opened wider. The milky white eyes were now focused, staring directly at Miles. A new sound came from the sergeant, a deep, wet gasping wheeze that was clearly not air, but the liquid being sucked into his throat. Hook. Miles finds the sergeant dead, his uniform shrunken and his eyes milky. A clear glass of the dark sap, reflecting a moving shadow, leads Miles to a display case where the entity has left a cryptic message referencing Locker 314, immediately followed by the sergeant's corpse gasping and staring directly at him. Sergeant Ramirez's sudden, puppet-like movement, combined with the sickening, liquid wheeze, snapped Miles out of his shock. This was not a corpse, it was a conduit, the sergeant's face, with its vacant, milky eyes, contorted into a slow, unnatural sneer. The jaw moved with a wet, grinding sound, and the flat, dry voice, the same voice that had whispered from Locker 314, the voice of Elara Vane, emerged from Ramirez's throat. "You see the debt, Miles. He paid with his time. You found her door. Now you must walk through it." Miles held his position, his gun steady, aimed at the center mass of his dead colleague. "Where is she? Where is Elara Vane?" he demanded, the words ringing with strained authority. The entity, speaking through Ramirez, tilted its head, an action that seemed to crack the sergeant's neck. A fresh drop of the dark, iridescent sap oozed from the corner of Ramirez's mouth, tracing a glistening path down his chin. "Her time is my time. Her space is my space. I wear her voice, but I wear him, too. An exchange, detective. Fair trade." Miles noticed the sergeant's hands, which were now gripping the edges of the desk. The fingernails, usually short and blunt, had elongated, becoming dark, brittle talons that were digging deep gouges into the wood. The shrunken uniform stretched tighter, revealing something beneath the fabric, a strange, sprawling pattern of raised, dark veins that pulsed faintly across the sergeant's chest. "What do you want?" Miles asked, keeping his voice even. "What is 314? The mouth on Ramirez's face smiled, a ghastly, silent rictus. "The door is the start. The lock is a choice. You bring me what opens the space, Miles. Bring me the token of the spiral. You cast it away, detective. Careless. That is not the way a key should be treated." The entity knew he had thrown the wooden object. It was omniscient within this building. "Why me?" Miles pressed. "Why this precinct?" The sergeant's body suddenly shuddered violently, as if a powerful electric current had passed through it. The entity's voice grew louder, straining against the confines of the sergeant's throat. "This place is old. The concrete whale. It sits on the junction of the veins of the old city. Locker 314 is a weak point. I've been waiting for a tired mind, a lone body. You are the only officer who cares about the cold cases, the forgotten ones. You listen to the things that don't make sense. You open the doors you shouldn't." The dark veins on Ramirez's chest pulsed brighter, and the shrunken shirt began to tear, revealing the pale, stretched skin beneath, which was covered in a network of fine, metallic fissures, like a cracked porcelain mask. Miles glanced quickly toward the evidence display case. The message written in sap: "He has your time, and you have mine." 314, suddenly seemed clear. Ramirez paid with his time, and the entity was demanding Miles's attention and action to open its space through Locker 314. "I won't bring you anything until I know Elara is alive," Miles stated, trying to bluff. The sergeant's head snapped again, the milky eyes seeming to widen. "You misunderstand. If you do not open the door, I will not be constrained to this single body. I will take more of your time, detective. I will take this building. And I will start by showing you what she saw." The sergeant raised one of his hands, the one with the talon-like nails. He slammed it down on the glass tumbler full of dark sap. The glass did not break. Instead, the dark liquid in the tumbler flashed with a brilliant, silver light, and the entire surface of the fluid turned into a miniature, swirling vision. Miles's eyes were forced to look. Inside the liquid, he saw a fleeting image, a quick, frantic snapshot of Elara Vane. She was in a space that was dark and wet, enclosed by walls of pulsating, dark brown organic material. Her eyes were wide with a silent, consuming terror, and she was holding a broken piece of wood, half of a spiral token. The vision vanished instantly, and the liquid returned to its flat, opaque darkness. Miles's resolve hardened. He had seen proof that Elara Vane was in some horrific, incomprehensible prison. "I'll get your key," Miles said, his voice flat with forced control. "But I need to know one thing. If I open that door, what happens to you?" "To him?" He gestured at Ramirez. The body of the sergeant slumped slightly, the false strength fading. The dry, alien voice was quieter now, almost a sibilant hiss. "The trade is honored. The time is paid. The vessel is exhausted. You will know. Now hurry. The veil is thinning. The center will not hold." Miles knew he had no choice. He had to retrieve the key from the dark corridor. It was the only way to get information, and the entity was clearly destabilizing the precinct. He turned and sprinted back toward the dark utility stairs, but as he ran, a new sound began from the front of the precinct, a high-pitched, insistent screaming that ripped through the silence, coming not from the sergeant's body, but from the exterior glass wall of the lobby, the sound of someone outside, trapped, and in unimaginable pain. "Hook, the entity demands the spiral token to open locker 314, claiming Elara is trapped in its space." It shows Miles a terrifying vision of Elara inside an organic prison. As Miles races to retrieve the key, a desperate, agonizing scream erupts from the precinct's exterior glass wall. The screaming was sharp, ragged, and undeniably human, a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. It echoed off the concrete canyon of the city streets outside, but seemed impossibly amplified by the vast, silent lobby of the precinct. Miles skidded to a stop near the utility stairs, his eyes snapping back toward the massive, plate glass front of the building. The glass was too thick to have shattered, and he could see nothing outside in the streetlights but the usual empty, rain-slicked pavement. That he moved cautiously back toward the front desk area, keeping the sergeant's motionless body in his peripheral vision. "Hey!" Miles shouted, moving toward the main entrance door, his hand reaching for the latch. "I'm coming out. Show yourself." The screaming stopped as instantly as it had begun. The silence that followed felt like a physical pressure building against the thick glass. Miles paused at the door, shining his tactical light through the glass. The street was deserted. No car, no person, no sign of a struggle. It was an impossible phantom sound that he looked down at the sergeant's body. Ramirez remained still, the milky eyes locked on the ceiling. Miles pressed his ear to the cold steel door. He heard nothing. He then pressed his ear directly against the smooth, cold surface of the main lobby glass wall, and there it was. Not a scream, but a faint, rhythmic scratching, coming from the exterior of the glass, high up, near the top corner of the 12-foot-tall panel. It was the same noise he had heard from the ceiling tile, sharp and hard, like a claw on chalk. That he pulled back and looked up. The beam of his flashlight revealed a tiny detail on the very top edge of the glass, high out of normal reach. A single, dark smear, the identical dark brown, iridescent sap that he had found in the locker, on his desk, and in the tumbler. The entity wasn't just in the building, it was manipulating the space around it, using sound and suggestion to draw him out. The scream hadn't been a warning, it had been bait. Miles glanced at the desk sergeant's cubicle clock. It was 3:15 a.m. He had wasted valuable seconds. He had to get the key. He turned and headed back toward the sublevel stairs, moving with renewed urgency. He hit the heavy fire door and took the stairs two at a time, plunging back into the oppressive chill of the basement. He reached the long, dark corridor of the locker banks. His flashlight beam swept the floor, looking for the thrown object. There it was, the token of the spiral, lying exactly where he had tossed it earlier. Miles quickly scooped it up. This time, the small piece of wood was stone-cold and inert. As he turned to face locker 314, a new sound echoed down the corridor, coming from the deep, unused end of the sublevel, the end that abutted the old, defunct city drainage pipes. It was a faint, high-pitched whimpering, almost animalistic. Miles didn't fall for the trick this time. He knew the entity was trying to distract him again. He ignored the sound and marched straight to locker 314 that he stood before the damaged metal box. The thin patch on the back wall still shimmered faintly, a dark membrane separating this reality from whatever lay beyond. That he held the spiral token in his palm. It felt heavy, a burden of impossible choices. That if I open it, what comes through? He realized the entity hadn't asked him to simply place the token near the locker. The message had been, "Bring me what opens the space." Miles looked at the jagged hole where he had pressed his finger earlier. He took the conical, human-like tooth he had found, the one with the shred of Elara Vane's blazer attached, and carefully inserted the sharp point into the small tear in the thinned metal. He then took the token of the spiral and, using the tooth as a guide, pressed the curved edge of the wooden disc against the soft metal patch, applying firm pressure. The moment the spiral token touched the thinned metal, a low, subsonic thrumming began inside the locker. The entire bank of lockers vibrated violently, the sound building to a deep, resonant roar that shook the foundations of the precinct. The dark brown sap on the back wall of the locker began to glow, a sickening, pulsating internal light. The metal was dissolving, the thin patch growing wider, turning into a massive, shimmering, spiral-shaped opening. Miles snatched the token and the tooth away just as the opening completed its formation. Standing before him, where the solid back of locker 314 should have been, was a swirling, opaque vortex. It was not a hole in a wall, but a hole in reality. It looked like a column of dense, flowing water, dark brown and infinitely deep, perfectly mirroring the spiral pattern of the token. The stench of decay, gardenias, and wet metal exploded from the portal, causing Miles to recoil, coughing, and then, a sound came from the vortex. It wasn't the voice of the entity. It was a single, weak, terrified sob. It was Elara Vane. Hook. Miles realizes the screams are a distraction and uses the human tooth and the spiral token to activate locker 314. The back wall dissolves into a massive, spiral-shaped portal of dark, flowing liquid, and through it, Miles hears the terrified sob of Elara Vane. Miles stared into the swirling vortex, his entire worldview shattering into dust. This was not a crime scene. This was something ancient, impossible, and terrifyingly real. "Elara," he shouted, stepping right up to the threshold of the liquid spiral. "Are you there? Can you hear me?" The sobbing inside the portal intensified, transforming into a muffled cry. From the deepest, darkest point of the vortex, the dry, flat voice of the entity, still wearing Elara Vane's voice, spoke, no longer a whisper, but a massive, resonant sound that felt like it was pressing on his lungs. "You opened it, Miles. The exchange is complete. Her door is my window. You have fulfilled your time." As the entity spoke, Miles noticed something horrifying. The thick, dark brown sap that comprised the vortex was not just flowing, it was extending. Thin, glistening tendrils of the liquid were creeping out of the spiral and onto the concrete floor of the precinct's sublevel, moving with a purposeful, silent speed toward the utility stairs. The entity was trying to escape, to spread through the building. "Stop!" Miles commanded, pointing his gun into the vortex, the weapon suddenly feeling useless against this liquid, spectral threat. "I want Elara Vane, now. You promised me the trade was honored. The trade is honored. She is inside my space. And I require your space. Your time is mine now, detective. You belong to the veins of the old city." The sap tendrils reached the first step of the utility staircase and began to crawl upward, accelerating as they sensed the air of the ground floor. Miles had seconds before this infestation reached the main precinct floor, potentially trapping or corrupting what remained of the building. He looked down at the spiral token still clutched in his left hand. The entity had clearly coveted this object. It was the key to opening the space. Logic, insane as it was, suggested it might also be the key to closing it. Miles raised his hand, holding the token up to the light. the entity's voice roared from the spiral, a sound of absolute fury. "No. Do not." Miles ignored the sound. He knew he couldn't close the portal without sacrificing the chance to save Elara, but he had to stop the spreading corruption. That he took the conical tooth, the one with the shred of Elara's jacket, and pressed its sharp point into the center of the wooden spiral token, puncturing the wood deeply. The moment the tooth pierced the spiral, the token did not glow. Instead, it emitted a high-pitched, resonant chime, a sound like an ancient, tuning fork striking glass, the liquid tendrils freezing on the stairs. The vortex in locker 314 began to vibrate violently, and the dark sap started to recede rapidly, sucking back into the center of the spiral. "You violate the compact. You tear the binding," the voice screamed. Miles pressed the tooth deeper into the token, ignoring the pain of the cold wood against his palm. "I need proof she is safe. Tell me how to get her out, and I'll remove the key," Miles demanded, trying to bargain from a position of impossible leverage. The vortex shrunk quickly, the sound of the receding sap a massive, liquid gulping noise. It was only the size of a dinner plate now, and through the opening, Miles could see the image of Elara Vane again. She was weakly holding up a hand, her eyes pleading. The voice that emerged was now weak, strained, and filled with a palpable agony, the voice of Elara Vane barely audible over the roaring vortex. "The price is proximity, Miles. The door can only be closed from the other side, but the price is a piece of the closure. A memory, a life. The concrete whale must feed its forgotten." Miles realized the horrific truth. The entity wasn't just using the locker, it was using the building itself. The vortex shrunk one last time, stabilizing into a tiny, shimmering pinprick of light on the back of the metal. The sound of Elara's voice stopped. Miles, fearing the portal was about to seal completely, yanked the tooth out of the spiral token. The sap pinprick vanished, and the thinned metal patch on the back of locker 314 returned to solid, albeit still thin, steel. Silence fell, absolute and final. The air was still, and the tendrils of sap on the stairs had dried instantly, turning into brittle, black lines of ash that crumbled to dust at the slightest breath. Elara Vane was gone. The entity was silenced. The building was temporarily saved. Miles looked down at the spiral token, now bearing a dark hole, and the conical tooth in his hand. That he heard a sound from the end of the corridor, the whimper he had dismissed earlier. It was still there, faint but insistent. Miles, now knowing the entity used sound as bait, approached the unused wing, flashlight beam steady. He rounded the final corner leading to the old drainage pipes. That he found no creature, no phantom. That he found a man, huddled against the cold concrete wall. He was thin, shivering, and covered in grime. He was wearing tattered, outdated clothing and was weeping uncontrollably, rocking back and forth. Miles recognized the face immediately. It was the face of Detective Arthur Vance, an officer who had worked this precinct decades ago and had mysteriously vanished without a trace, a cold case that had been forgotten long before Miles had even joined the force. Arthur Vance looked up, his eyes wide with a terror that surpassed any horror Miles had yet seen. "Miles," Vance whispered, his voice hoarse. "They keep us here, they drain the forgotten. They made me see her. Elara. I saw her door, hook." Miles temporarily closes the portal by piercing the spiral token with the tooth, learning that the building feeds on the forgotten and the portal must be closed from the other side. He then finds Detective Arthur Vance, a decades-old missing person from the precinct, who is terrified and claims he saw Elara's door. Miles lowered his gun, holstering it slowly, not wanting to frighten the already traumatized man. Detective Arthur Vance, a ghost from the precinct's past, was frail, his skin almost translucent, and his body was shaking violently, though the basement wasn't particularly cold. "Vance," Miles said softly, using the formal name. "I'm Detective Miles Corbin. It's all right. You're safe now. You've been missing a long time. Tell me what happened. What did you see?" Vance flinched away from the light, shielding his eyes. No, not safe. Never safe. They only let me out, because the door was stressed. They needed a release valve. They sent me to confuse you." He paused, his eyes darting frantically around the dark corridor. "The concrete whale, it's hungry." Miles sat down against the opposite wall, establishing a non-threatening posture. "Who is they, Arthur? And what is the door?" Vance hugged his knees tightly, beginning to rock again. "The Weavers. They live between the space. The things that aren't quite solid, that feed on neglect and time. The city's old infrastructure, the pipes, the wiring, the abandoned tunnels, those are their veins. The precinct is their heart. Locker 314, that's where the old evidence was stored. The things that were too real to disappear, but too cold to solve. The Nexus." He took a ragged, shuddering breath. "When I disappeared 22 years ago, I wasn't just gone. I was pulled. I walked past that locker bank, and it was soft. I touched it, and I fell inside. Into the sap." Miles looked at the black ash trails of sap on the utility stairs. "The dark liquid. The sap. What is it?" "It's the blood of the forgotten," Vance whispered, tears mixing with the grime on his face. "It's concentrated time. It's how they hold the space together. I was inside for decades. But time doesn't pass there normally. It just drains." "Did you see Elara Vane?" Miles asked, holding up the conical tooth attached to the shred of her blazer. Vance gasped, recoiling from the tooth. "Yes. Just now. When the door opened, I saw her through the veil. She's not like me. She's fresh. They're trying to incorporate her. She's trapped in the organic walls of the space. They make us watch." Vance pointed a trembling finger toward the empty locker 314. "They made me watch her struggle. They made me hear her screaming from the outside of the glass, the way they make all their prey scream." Miles realized the implication. The screams outside the lobby window were Elara's screams, amplified and projected by the Weavers, using Vance as an unseen witness and Miles as the target. The entity speaking through Sergeant Ramirez, it called itself a Weaver? They don't have names. They just are. They borrow our voices, our time, our uniforms. Ramirez was a good, predictable vessel. Slow pulse, deep sleep. Easy to infest. He paid for you to find the key. "The key, the spiral token," Miles said, looking at the punctured wood. "How do I get her out?" Vance's expression turned utterly bleak. "You can't. Not from here. The door is closed, Miles. But they told you the truth. The door must be closed from the other side. Someone has to go in and sacrifice a piece of the binding." "What sacrifice?" "A life for a life. A time for a time. That's the binding. You go in, and she comes out. But only if you can find the center of the spiral and lock it from the inside." A new sound started, a faint, low-frequency humming, coming from the very depths of the sublevel, much further than the drainage pipes, far into the old, forgotten city foundations. It was a sound that vibrated not just in the air, but in Miles's bones. Vance instantly dissolved into a fresh spasm of terror. The center. They're pulling the energy back. They're repairing the break. They'll pull the building down. You have to go. Now, before they seal the door forever. Miles looked at the pathetic, broken figure of the forgotten detective, then at the innocent, dented locker 314. He knew he couldn't leave Vance to be reabsorbed. He stood up. "Come on, Arthur. We're getting out of here." Miles helped the weak man to his feet, guiding him toward the utility stairs. but as they reached the fire door, the humming from the basement intensified, vibrating the metal frame. A shadow, long, thin, and stretched, fell across the wall near the door, cast by a light source that did not exist. Miles looked back. The shimmering patch on locker 314, which had been solid metal, began to liquefy again, turning from steel to the familiar dark brown sap. The spiral was reopening. Miles shoved the frail Vance through the fire door onto the ground floor. "Go to the front desk. Get out. Run." Vance, galvanized by a primal terror, bolted down the hallway. Miles turned, pulling his gun, and faced the dark corridor. He saw the shadow retracting swiftly, sucked back toward the reopening spiral. He looked down at the spiral token in his hand. If the portal was fully open, the sap would flow out, and the weavers would infest the precinct. He had to go back in. Miles knew what he had to do. He jammed the token and the tooth into his pocket, gripped his flashlight and sidearm, and sprinted back down the corridor, toward the freshly liquefying locker 314. Hook. Vance confirms the weavers sustain themselves on forgotten time, and that Elara is trapped in their organic prison. The portal begins to reopen as the weavers try to reseal the breach, forcing Miles to choose to send Vance to safety and prepare to enter the vortex. Miles didn't stop to think about the insanity of what he was doing. Logic was dead. Only the urgency of the moment and the image of Elara's terrified face in the liquid portal mattered. He plunged back into the dark corridor. Locker 314 was now weeping. The sap had fully dissolved the back panel, opening a vortex about 4 feet in diameter. The sight was hypnotically terrifying, a massive, dense, swirling column of dark, oily liquid, perfectly mirroring the spiral on his token, pulling the very air into its depths. The low, resonant humming of the weaver's resurgence was deafening. He could feel the raw pull of the portal, a subtle but distinct pressure trying to drag him forward. He stopped at the edge of the corrosive puddle of sap that ringed the locker. He couldn't go in armed. His metal weapon would likely be instantly corroded or, worse, become a conduit for the entity. Miles holstered his sidearm, the metallic click sounding pathetic against the roar of the vortex. He kept his flashlight and the spiral token clutched in his left hand, the conical tooth ready in his pocket. Taking a deep, shaky breath of the sickening, sweet and metallic air, Miles took one final step and plunged his right arm, shoulder deep, into the swirling, viscous sap of the portal. The moment his skin broke the surface, the liquid did not feel cold or hot. It felt like compressed noise and static electricity. A searing, burning pain shot up his arm, not from temperature, but from an overwhelming sensory input, as if every nerve ending was screaming at once. He screamed, pulling his arm back instantly. The sap that clung to his sleeve and glove was already smoking, the material dissolving rapidly. He fought the urge to vomit. He couldn't go in head first. The sap would instantly blind or dissolve him. Miles remembered Vance's fragmented words. The door is the start. The lock is a choice. The center of the spiral. He realized the choice was not just to enter, but how. The portal was a massive, fluid keyhole. Miles looked at the spiral token, then at the still open, humming vortex. The token was the key. The hole he had made in the center of the token was the lock. He took the token and, holding it flat, pressed the solid wood face directly against the swirling, liquid surface of the vortex. The deafening hum instantly changed pitch, dropping into a much deeper, bass vibration that vibrated through Miles's chest cavity. The dense liquid parted around the token, forming a perfectly dry, cylindrical tunnel just wide enough for him to slip through. Miles didn't hesitate. He took one last look at the hallway of the empty precinct, the world he knew, and stepped through the dry tunnel and into the abyss. The instant he crossed the threshold, the tunnel collapsed behind him. Miles found himself in an environment that defied physics and sanity. He wasn't falling, or floating. He was standing on a surface that felt like wet, taut skin, which rose and fell with a slow, biological pulse. The air was thick, humid, and smelled like blood and copper. Above him, instead of a ceiling, was an endless, churning mass of the dark, viscous sap, the blood of the forgotten, flowing in impossible rivers against a black, starless void that he was inside the veil. Miles shone his flashlight. The walls of this space were not concrete or metal, but a pulsating, dark brown, organic material, the organic walls that Vance had mentioned. They were covered in a network of impossibly precise, thread-like metallic fissures, exactly like the ones that had appeared on Sergeant Ramirez's chest. The fissures glowed with a faint, crimson light, like slow, painful heartbeat. Miles took a step, and the floor groaned beneath his boot. He heard the weak sobbing again, closer this time. Elara. His flashlight beam swept the undulating tunnel. The passage narrowed sharply ahead, twisting into a serpentine, dark space. Miles moved forward, passing objects half submerged in the pulsing wall skin, a shredded police jacket, a faded photo of a child, a bent, antique skeleton key. They were the forgotten relics the weavers fed on. As he moved deeper, the tunnel opened into a large, cavernous space, and in the center of the cavern, suspended by hundreds of the metallic, glowing fissures that extended from the ceiling and walls, was Elara Vane. She was conscious, her head hanging low, her skin pale, and she was entirely naked, covered only by the network of dark, glistening fissures that held her body like an organic web. She was slowly, visibly thinning, her body being drained by the feeding channels. "Miles, get out," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. The flat, dry voice of the weaver did not come from Elara. It resonated from the very walls of the cavern, a deafening, echoing chorus. "Welcome, Detective. You brought the key into my space. Now your memory becomes the foundation. The veil is sealed. You are forgotten." Hook. Miles uses the spiral token to create a dry tunnel into the vortex, finding himself inside the weaver's organic, pulsating prison. He finds Elara Vane suspended in the center of the cavern, covered in the metallic fissures that are draining her life force, as the weaver's voice echoes from the walls, proclaiming the veil is sealed. The walls themselves were roaring now, a chorus of the flat, dry voice, layered with the terrified whispers and moans of hundreds of forgotten victims trapped within the organic matrix. Miles stood at the entrance of the cavern, his flashlight the only independent source of light in this horrifying interior. The sheer scale of Elara's captivity, suspended and consumed by the glowing fissures, galvanized him. "You took her. And Arthur Vance. You feed on what we neglect." Miles shouted, his voice cracking against the massive, resonating sound of the weaver. "Silence the noise. You are a debt paid in full. The concrete whale now has your time. Drain him." The organic floor beneath Miles began to pulse rapidly. From the walls, the metallic, crimson fissures detached themselves and began to snake toward him, moving like millions of razor-sharp wires seeking purchase. The air was filled with a high-pitched, electric whine as the tendrils closed in. Miles didn't run. He pulled the conical tooth from his pocket. He knew he couldn't fight this thing with bullets. He had to fight it with its own logic. He gripped the tooth and plunged it into the pulsating, taut skin of the floor right next to his boot. A sickening, wet shriek echoed through the cavern, not from Elara, but from the surrounding walls. The organic material convulsed violently. The fissures attacking Miles instantly stalled, retracting slightly as if in pain. The tooth. It's from one of their own. Miles realized. The entity had left it behind, a careless piece of biological evidence, possibly a temporary anchor for its physical form when it spoke through the sergeant. Miles used the moment of distraction. He sprinted toward Elara, dodging the retreating tendrils. He reached the column of fissures holding her, which were slightly thicker and more established than the ones near the floor. "Elara, I'm getting you out. Hold on." He aimed his light at the central mass of fissures just above her head, the nexus where the most prominent channels connected to the ceiling. He pulled out the spiral token, the key that opened the door. He had learned from the message on the sergeant's desk. The door must be closed from the other side. The entity's scream of rage intensified, realizing Miles's intent. "Stop him. He will tear the binding. Absorb him." The fissures renewed their attack, pouring down from the ceiling like a metallic rain. One of the wires lashed out and wrapped around Miles's exposed forearm, digging in deep. A searing, mental pain shot into his mind, a rush of images of forgotten crimes, cold case reports, and the endless, crushing despair of the precinct's solitude. The Weaver was attempting to overwhelm his consciousness and drain his memory and time. Miles fought through the pain, ignoring the blood that welled up on his arm. He brought the spiral token up and, with a desperate, two-handed shove, jammed the wooden disc hole first into the main cluster of thick, glowing fissures above Elara's head. The token was the center. The tooth had made the hole. The fissures were the lock. The instant the token seated, the entire cavern went silent. The roaring, the whispering, the humming, all ceased. The crimson glow of the fissures died, turning a dull, lifeless gray. Elara Vane, released from the active energy, dropped a foot, her body supported only by the now inert, brittle wires. Miles looked at her face. Her eyes were still terrified, but focused. "The lock," she gasped. "You locked it. Now the sacrifices." Miles understood. The entity demanded a memory, a life. The concrete whale must feed its forgotten. He had brought two pieces of the forgotten with him, Detective Vance's fate, and his own painful memories. The binding, Miles. Use the sacrifices to tear the exit open. Elara pleaded. Miles took the conical tooth and, with a deep breath, drove the sharp point into the thickest part of the now inert cluster of gray fissures next to the token. The sap that had been slowly flowing along the fissures suddenly burst forth in a jet, spraying the cavern with the sticky, dark liquid. Then, from the spot where the tooth had been driven in, a crack appeared. It was a crack in the organic wall, but through the crack, Miles saw something impossible: the dull, chipped, gray paint of a steel door. "That's the outside," Miles shouted. "That's the locker." The crack widened rapidly, and the roaring voice of the Weaver, now distant and weak, screamed its final, fading threat from the depths of the sap rivers: "You break the pact. The sacrifices are unclean. You will be trapped forever in the void." Miles grabbed the lifeless, brittle tendril still holding Elara Vane. "I'm pulling you through, now." With a mighty tug, he ripped the desiccated wires away from her body. He grabbed Elara by the arm, and together, they plunged through the widening crack in the organic wall, aiming for the promise of cold steel and concrete beyond. Hooked, Miles uses the spiral token to lock the main fissure nexus, stopping the draining. Elara confirms the need for a sacrifice to tear the exit open. Miles uses the conical tooth to crack the organic wall, revealing the steel of locker 314 on the other side, and escapes with Elara as the entity's power fades. Miles and Elara Vane tumbled out of the cavernous void and slammed onto the cold, dusty concrete floor of the Midvalley Precinct sublevel. The impact was jarring, a return to gravity and hard reality that felt both painful and miraculous. Miles immediately scrambled to his feet, pulling Elara up with him. They were no longer in front of a giant vortex. The back of locker 314 was solid metal again, dented and scarred, but inert. The sap and the shimmering light were gone. The only remaining evidence was the sticky, dark residue that outlined the faint spiral where the portal had been, and a pervasive smell of ozone and wet earth. Miles's arm, where the fissure had lathed him, was bleeding freely, but the searing, burning pain was gone, replaced by a dull ache. Elara, though weak and severely malnourished, was breathing and conscious. "The stairs. We have to get out of the basement," Miles urged, shining his light toward the utility door. They stumbled toward the exit. As they reached the stairs, Miles paused and shone his light back at the locker. He reached into his pocket. The spiral token was gone. So was the conical tooth. The exit had accepted its pieces of the binding. Miles pushed Elara through the fire door first, then followed, sealing the door tight behind them. They emerged into the quiet, dark ground floor. Miles scanned the corridor, his gun now back in his hand. The sickly, sweet scent of gardenias was completely gone, replaced by the normal, stale air of the precinct. They made it to the front desk. Sergeant Ramirez was exactly as Miles had left him, sitting upright, his eyes milky white, his body completely motionless. The shrunken uniform and the metallic fissures were gone. He looked simply like a man who had died peacefully at his post. The elegant glass tumbler of sap was gone, too. Miles went straight for the phone. "This is Detective Corbin. Major crimes. Midvalley Precinct. I need an ambulance and a forensics team dispatched immediately. We have a recovered missing person, Elara Vane, and a deceased officer. Sergeant Ramirez." As he finished the call, Elara collapsed against the desk, shivering uncontrollably. "The man," she whispered, her voice reedy. "The old man. Vance. Did he get out?" Miles looked around the empty corridor. "I told him to run. He was terrified. He must have made it out the front." Hours later, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the city, the precinct was a beehive of activity. Forensics were meticulously working the sublevel and the front desk. Miles and Elara were bundled into separate ambulances. Later that afternoon, Miles sat in a hospital bed, his arm bandaged, being debriefed by a stone-faced deputy chief, Clara Hayes. "Detective Corbin, your account is extraordinary," Hayes said, tapping her pen against her notepad. "You claim Sergeant Ramirez was killed by a liquid entity that emerged from a locker and that Elara Vane was found in a fugue state in the basement, claiming she'd been in a different dimension. No offense, Miles, but it sounds like a bad acid trip." "The forensics will back up the unusual findings, Chief," Miles insisted, rubbing his temples. "The unusual residue in locker 314, the evidence of extreme physical terror in Ramirez's death, and look at Elara Vane. They drained her." Hayes paused. "Forensics found a small patch of unidentified organic residue in the sublevel. They found nothing at the front desk. Sergeant Ramirez's preliminary cause of death is a sudden, massive cardiac arrest. Natural causes, Miles. The pressure of the moment likely finished him." "And Arthur Vance?" Miles pushed. "The missing officer from 20 years ago. I left him on the ground floor. He should be running the streets." Hayes shook her head sadly. "Detective Vance is still a cold case, Miles. There is no evidence, no sighting. He hasn't been found. Perhaps, in the stress of the incident, you hallucinated his presence." Miles looked out the window at the familiar, indifferent city skyline. The world had snapped back to its neat, clean lines, erasing the horrific. Breach. The Weavers had been efficient. They had absorbed the evidence, erased their tracks, and taken their forgotten sacrifice, Arthur Vance, back into the veil. Elara Vane, now in stable condition, had given her statement. She remembered walking past the old railway yard, seeing a strange light, and then waking up in the hospital. Her time in the Weavers' space had been utterly suppressed by the entity. The Weavers were protected by the very disbelief of the mundane world. A week later, Miles returned to the Midvalley Precinct. His office, MC3, was cleaned. The metallic hair was gone. The cleaning crew had been efficient. He walked past the front desk. A young, eager officer sat in Ramirez's old chair, a temporary replacement. Everything was normal. Miles walked into his office and sat at his desk. He reached for his current cold case file, the case of Elara Vane, and marked it closed, subject found. He then pulled out his old stack of truly cold cases. Cases of people who had simply vanished. He stopped at the file labeled Detective Arthur Vance. As he placed the Vance file on top of his new, active pile, he noticed a tiny, subtle detail on the corkboard of forgotten case photos, pinned right above the old photograph of the missing Detective Vance. Miles saw a single, small, dark brown smear. It was faint, but unmistakably the iridescent residue of the weaver's sap. It hadn't been cleaned, the smear was